April 19, 2015. It's a warm Sunday morning in Delray Beach, a quaint coastal town along Florida's Atlantic shore.
Delray Beach is actually a much different vibe than some of your more common places in South Florida. Delray Beach is a much slower pace.
You see people fishing, you see the boats in the canals. That's kind of what people are about, just the natural beauty, the relaxation, the water.
But around 9 a.m. this morning, a local resident is traveling along a remote stretch of road when he spots something unusual.
He noticed something that looked suspicious in a ditch. And as he got closer, he did realize that it was a young lady.
He sees her laying in the grass, unresponsive, and, he's not sure what's wrong. He contacts 911.
First responders race to the location.
Protocol when someone's unresponsive is to get to the scene as soon as possible because there's a possibility that person still could be alive.
They had no idea if this woman was having a medical issue or what was going on.
When Palm Beach County deputies arrive on the scene, they quickly realize they're too late to help the young woman.
The police get there, and it becomes immediately apparent that obviously she is deceased.
Her body was cold to the touch, so police knew that she had been dead for some time.
At that point, you realize there's no saving this person. Now your job is to preserve the scene.
And as deputies begin to secure the area, they notice something lying near the woman's body.
There was a wallet on the ground next to the body, and inside of that wallet, police found an ID card.
They quickly identified who she was.
Her name was Vanessa Williams.
28-year-old single mother Vanessa Williams had a smile that could light up a room.
She was this beautiful young lady.
She was very social and enjoyed spending time with her friends.
Ambitious and caring to her core, Vanessa had always dreamed of becoming a therapist. But a relationship from her teenage years with a handsome classmate named Nate Tyler had taken her on a different path.
They were high school sweethearts who were very much in love.
Vanessa was so certain that they would go the distance that she even got Nate's name tattooed on her neck. But when she got pregnant, it caused a lot of friction between the two of them.
The stress of teenage parenthood was too much for their relationship to bear, and the couple parted ways soon after the birth of their son.
On her own, as a single parent, she resolved to give her son the best life she could manage. But she kind of had to put her dreams of becoming a therapist on hold.
She was a wonderful mom.
Vanessa managed to finish school while juggling motherhood, but instead of going to college, she jumped into a relationship with a new partner, a man named Stuart Bird.
After graduating from high school, she pretty immediately fell in love with another man from town. They moved in together, and he started helping her with her son.
Well, hey there. How was work?
Busy.
Stuart seemed like someone who would take care of her. He had a lot of love for his family, and that was something that Vanessa really appreciated about him.
They talked about getting married and having kids together.
But it was another union that wasn't meant to last.
Their relationship eventually became a little bit toxic.
They split up after 3 years together.
By her mid-20s, Vanessa once again found herself struggling as a single mom.
She went on with her life, trying to pick up the pieces, but she never gave up on love.
She's trying to find different people that will give her the love she so greatly desires. And she's meeting disappointment after disappointment with the types of men that she's involved with.
Finally, in 2011, Vanessa met a man who seemed different from the rest.
Excuse me, miss?
Yeah.
I think you dropped this.
Oh, thank you.
John Chapman was a handsome military veteran, young, fit, knew how to present himself.
They were two very good-looking young people who immediately were attracted to one another.
I don't mean to be too forward, but do you think I can get your phone number?
Sure. Yeah.
As they got to know each other over the coming weeks, John and Vanessa realized they were both looking for the same things in life.
John wanted a big family. He wanted kids. They realized maybe we could build this life together.
So I've never really been with somebody who's felt like a life partner. I've always ended up alone.
Those days are over. I promise.
He was Prince Charming for her. So she and John Chapman fell in love. They started dating.
Vanessa felt like she'd finally found a relationship that would last.
Things were going really well for Vanessa this time around.
With John's help at home, she was able to focus a little bit more on herself. She was working as a medical assistant during the day and taking classes at night so that she could work towards her dreams of becoming a therapist.
But now, instead of seeing her dreams come true, Vanessa Williams has been found dead in a secluded area of Palm Beach County.
Police quickly went into trying to find out what had happened to this beautiful young lady.
They weren't sure if this was some sort of accident or if she was out walking when maybe she suffered some type of medical emergency.
When detectives arrive on the scene, they move in for a closer look at Vanessa's body.
When the police turn over the body, there are numerous stab wounds on her face, on her neck, on her back.
Vanessa was stabbed over 23 times. Whoever did this wanted to make sure that she suffered bad.
After a series of failed relationships, 28-year-old Vanessa Williams finally found a man to stand by her side.
You have John as this military man, and he looks refined, and he's showing himself in a way that, hey, I'm strong and I can protect you. And this is the kind of strength that she's looking for.
The happy couple was looking forward to a bright future together. But now, Vanessa has been found dead on the side of a remote road in Palm Beach County.
It's the beginning of the investigation. They don't have all the information, but from what they've seen so far, this appears to be gruesome, violent.
They were able to determine that Vanessa had been stabbed 23 times.
The question now is, why?
They find money, they find jewelry. Her chain is still on her.
The fact those property pieces that were still there with her indicated not a robbery.
They believe that this is a personal attack. This was someone who had malice and anger, and they took it out on Vanessa Williams.
However, due to a lack of blood pooling, investigators suspect that the violent stabbing didn't happen here.
Law enforcement concludes that she must have been killed somewhere else and brought to this location.
It almost looked like there was an intent to try and hide her location, maybe a hasteful attempt at best.
There are other things there that indicate that they left in a hurry. They see an indentation from where a tire was. They find a flip-flop.
It looked like when Vanessa's body was dragged out of whatever vehicle it was in, all this other debris got dragged out with her.
One item in particular stands out to the investigators.
They find a floor mat from a vehicle that's soaked in blood. and they really want to know whose blood is this? Does this belong to the victim?
There's also potential evidence for DNA from the assailant. Most stabbings or cuttings, the person who is the attacker will typically injure themselves.
Detectives spot another crucial piece of evidence left behind by Vanessa's killer.
They find a wooden-handled knife that looks like it could be the murder weapon.
After the evidence is bagged and sent out for testing, Vanessa's body is transported to the medical examiner's office for an autopsy.
Judging by the degree of lividity in Vanessa's body, the medical examiner believes that she had been dead for about 24 hours.
Lividity is the accumulation of the blood in the lower extremities of the body.
A blood test reveals another surprising new piece of information, that at the time of her death, Vanessa had a street drug known as Flocka in her system.
Flocka came in, I believe, around 2015, 2014 in the Florida area here. There was a lot of reports of crazy behavior, zombie-like behavior, aggressiveness, extreme strength.
Flocka took bath salts and it was manipulated, and it gave you a much more intense high and hallucinations, and anybody could pretty much get their hands on it.
Immediately, law enforcement are thinking that maybe this was some drug deal gone wrong. Maybe this was a drug user who had crossed someone.
Armed with this new information, detectives begin trying to learn more about who their victim was.
One of the things that they observed that the medical examiner told them about was that there is a tattoo on the back of Vanessa's neck, and the name of that tattoo was Nate.
Vanessa's social media appears to confirm that she had a man in her life around the time she died. But his name isn't Nate. It's John Chapman.
One of the first places police look is to the boyfriend. He is a former military guy, someone that police can identify with.
When police spoke with John, he was devastated to find out what had happened to his girlfriend. He said that she was a wonderful mom, a great person.
I hate to be the one to tell you.
John strikes the detectives as sad, but not especially surprised.
I was afraid something like this might happen.
He said she had some habits that she had fallen into, involving drugs and alcohol.
John tells the police that Vanessa's drug use had been getting worse lately. A lot worse.
It started out, I just had a long day at work, and I just need a little something to take the edge off. But over time, you start to need the high.
Vanessa had her struggles. And with her having children, with her having the responsibility of being a mother, of being a partner, trying to co-parent, there are certain things that contributed to her drug use.
Vanessa, seriously? This is getting way out of hand.
John Chapman told them that Vanessa had been out of control, and in one of those drug and alcohol-fueled incidents, she left.
How about you stop telling me how to live my life?
He said she had taken off without telling him where she was going.
He tried to call her to figure out where she was. He couldn't get in contact with her.
I thought that I was going to be able to see her again, but...
Do you know anyone that might want to hurt her? Drug dealer, ex-boyfriend?
I know she had issues with her ex.
John actually shared with police that Vanessa's relationship with Stewart was extremely toxic. They couldn't have a civil conversation. It was very volatile.
They had some mutual friends and would run into each other from time to time. And Stewart would always try to weasel his way back in.
She couldn't fully get away from this guy.
And according to John Chapman, Stewart Bird had a history of domestic violence against Vanessa Williams. He had attacked her in the past, and of course, John felt like he would do it again.
I didn't trust her. And I know she didn't either.
He told the police that that's the place where they should start looking.
John was adamant that Stuart Bird had something to do with this.
Vanessa Williams' boyfriend, John Chapman, has just told Palm Beach County Police that she was battling drug addiction in the months before she was murdered.
Vanessa was a mom, a student, a healthcare worker, and unfortunately, she had turned to substances to deal with all of the stressors in her life.
Before you know it, we're self-medicating. And so where someone may say, that could never be me, before you know it, it is you.
According to John, Vanessa had been behaving increasingly erratically in the weeks before she was killed. And shortly before her body was discovered, she'd complained about running into her ex, Stuart Bird.
After getting this information, police immediately went into the background of Stuart, and they discovered that he had an extensive record. He had burglary, domestic strangulation, grand theft, and child abuse.
At that moment, Stuart Bird became suspect number one.
But when detectives bring Stuart in for questioning, he seems shocked.
Stuart denied having any responsibility for killing Vanessa.
What? No. Listen, y'all have the wrong guy.
However, he does acknowledge there were moments in their 3-year relationship he's not proud of.
He admitted that things got pretty heated between them.
Did arguments ever get physical between the two of you?
Yeah. But that happens sometimes.
With that relationship, there was domestic violence.
It shows his ability, his possibility of creating a violent scenario with Vanessa.
They want to know, where were you on the night of April the 18th?
According to Stuart, he has an alibi for the night Vanessa was killed.
Stuart Bird tells them, well, I was working all night. He gives them the name of his employer.
You can call my supervisor right now. He'll tell you.
Police were able to contact his employer, who confirmed that Stuart was definitely at work on the night that Vanessa was murdered. So now they're back to square one.
Eager to drum up new leads, police shift their focus to the people who knew Vanessa best.
Vanessa's parents lived about an hour away in Miami, and while they were still grieving the loss of their daughter, they were ready to talk to detectives.
Vanessa's parents were devastated. It is extremely heartbreaking as a parent to know that your child was killed.
Vanessa's parents tell detectives that their daughter had a long history of troubled relationships.
I always tell them, men, they want only your money and something else. Right. And I be telling them, be careful who you're dealing with.
So in cases like this, either you have a lot of suspects or you have nobody. And this case had a lot of suspects. She was involved with a lot of different romantic interests.
Vanessa's parents also confirm what John Chapman said in his interview about Vanessa's rampant drug use.
She went used to drugs.
You know what kind of drugs? Cocaine?
I don't know. That I don't know.
She was dealing with a lot. It's like having the devil on one shoulder and the angel on the other shoulder. I have my responsibilities, but I don't know how to cope.
Vanessa's parents say the last time they saw their daughter was about a week ago when she stopped by for a surprise visit.
What time was that?
Around 5 5:30.
What kind of car did she have?
She didn't have a car. She said it's a friend car. She was driving a truck.
What kind of truck?
White, I think white, I don't know if it's a Ford.
The truck was alleged to have belonged to Corey Summers, a friend of hers.
But other than Corey's name, Vanessa's parents know nothing about him.
I met him once.
Okay.
After Vanessa left in Corey's truck, Her parents never heard from her again.
I started texting her, but I never had no response from her.
Did you call her after that? Did you ever, after that point, talk to her again?
Never.
Based on this information, investigators want to speak with Corey Summers as soon as possible.
The question now was, did Corey have a reason to want Vanessa dead?
After speaking with her parents, Florida detectives have learned that Vanessa Williams was last seen driving her friend Corey Summers' truck around the time she was killed.
Did you ever, after that point, talk to her again?
Never.
When detectives reach out to Corey Summers, they're surprised to hear he's been waiting for a call from law enforcement.
What's that? Anyone phone it?
Corey thought the police were calling about his truck, the one that he had allegedly let Vanessa borrow.
Corey explains that he's a long-haul trucker who'd been out on the road until a few days earlier.
When he came back from one of his long-haul trips on April 17th, his truck was missing. There was a police report made.
When detectives explain they're calling under graver circumstances, Corey seems grief-stricken.
Here's the deal. We're working a homicide investigation. Vanessa's dead.
I don't believe it.
He agrees to come into the police station to give an official statement.
Corey confirmed that he and Vanessa were friends, and he said he allowed her to stay at his place after she and her boyfriend John got into a huge argument about her drug use.
She asked me to stay. I told her okay because I don't hardly ever be home.
He says that Vanessa has stayed with me from time to time. I've allowed her to crash here when she's needed to. I'll see her, and then I'll go out on the road for several days, and then I'll come back.
Corey insists the relationship between them was entirely platonic.
One of the things I gotta ask you, were you intimate at all, you and her?
No.
Never?
No.
Okay.
Corey, he is an individual that sort of has put himself in a savior position. He tries to help people. He's trying to help Vanessa, trying to give her a place to stay.
They had an arrangement where Corey would allow Vanessa to use his pickup truck while he was out on the road.
She doesn't have the transportation to get and back and forth from work.
Okay.
So I told her to use my truck. Just be careful with it.
But the last time he got home, Corey says Vanessa and his truck were gone.
Vanessa was missing, and his apartment was in shambles, as if there had been a struggle or fight going on in there.
I know she had company, but I don't know who she had there.
He didn't know what happened. He tried to reach out to her. He couldn't get in contact with her.
In speaking with Corey, he seemed to be very forthcoming, very cooperative, very willing to help the police, but they are not sure if they are able to trust him.
Again, I got to ask you this because if it comes out later on, I want to make sure we're clear. Did you guys have any intimate relationship between you two?
A long time ago.
When was that?
That was months ago.
But before you told me that you didn't.
We're not really sure if there's a relationship there. Maybe, maybe not. So you have to look at that. Was he jealous?
But Corey insists he wasn't even in the same state at the time when police believe Vanessa was killed.
I was in Georgia.
You were in Jersey?
Georgia.
At the end of the interview, Corey agrees to turn his cell phone over to police.
We need your phone just to make sure everything checks out.
Sure, okay.
And while it's sent out for analysis, detectives track down the last name on their list. The father of Vanessa's oldest son, Nate Tyler.
Although he and Vanessa broke up years ago, they were still on good terms for the sake of their son.
They were extremely close, although they were only platonic.
And according to Nate, the last time he saw Vanessa, she'd confided in him that she was struggling.
You know, she had been telling me
things weren't going well with John, her boyfriend. And she'd been staying with some other guy, Corey, I think. Yeah, we've already talked to Corey.
Nate tells the investigators that on another occasion, he'd witnessed the tension between Vanessa and John firsthand.
There was an incident that Nate shared with police where they were all hanging out and something transpired that really ticked John off to the extent that he started throwing furniture, became vulgar, got very violent.
It was shocking, you know? It happened out of nowhere.
Did Vanessa say these type of outbursts happen often?
Yeah, she did.
She told him that John was abusive, that John would fly off the handle for different reasons.
She confided in Nate about all of the threatenings, the stalkings, the verbal abuse, the beatings that she was getting.
Based on what they're hearing from Nate, detectives have to wonder, has John been misleading them all along?
At this point, getting out there, finding John, and getting face-to-face with John is very important.
But when detectives try to bring John Chapman in for another round of questioning, they quickly hit a roadblock.
They'd say, we gotta pick this guy up and talk to him again. But there's only one problem. He's gone. He's on the run.
In the spring of 2015, Palm Beach County investigators have had no shortage of suspects in the murder of 28-year-old Vanessa Williams. So far, they've spoken with her ex, Stuart Bird, close friend, Corey Summers, and even her high school sweetheart, Nate Tyler. But unfortunately, all three men seem to have airtight alibis.
Thanks to phone records, police were able to confirm that their three prior suspects had not been in the area at the time Vanessa was murdered.
Stuart was confirmed to be at work, and Corey in Georgia. And Nate was out of town visiting some friends.
However, in speaking with Nate Tyler, investigators have unearthed a new suspect, a man they're already familiar with, Vanessa's most recent boyfriend, John Chapman.
According to Nate, Vanessa had confided in him about her very tumultuous relationship with John.
John had been abusing her, both physically and verbally.
She was trying to get away from John. She was trying to cut ties with him.
He conducted himself in a way that was reckless, dangerous, and possibly deadly.
Detectives want to speak with John Chapman again as soon as possible, but they'll have to find him first.
He's gone. He's on the run.
He wasn't at home or at work. He wasn't answering his phone.
Detectives think John may be traveling in Corey Summers' missing pickup truck. And before long, they receive a promising tip about the stolen vehicle's location.
There was actually an APB put out on Corey's truck, and they found it in front of the home of a Lana Palmer.
Lana Palmer is alleged to have been romantically involved with John Chapman. They had an on-again, off-again relationship between the two of them.
By the time police respond, the truck is gone.
They go in there, no John Chapman, but they do find Lana Palmer.
Can I help you?
When they questioned Lana about the truck in front of her home, she admitted that John had come by.
The last time that she saw John Chapman, on April the 18th, he came there driving a white truck, clothes covered in blood.
John? Oh my God, what did you do?
He was very bloody. He looked like he had been through just too much. And showing up to her home, asking for refuge, if you will.
She asked him, what happened, John?
He said he'd been fighting with someone. I could tell he was lying, though.
Baby, I had to defend myself.
He told her that he had gotten into a fight with one of Vanessa's ex-boyfriends. She didn't believe the story, but since he was acting so weird, she just allowed him to come inside, take a shower, and clean up.
Okay, just go rinse all that off, please.
But after John washed up, Lana witnessed more strange behavior from him.
She saw him take a SIM card out of a phone and rip it in half.
She realized that there was something awry here, and the story that he was given just didn't line up.
I don't know what you're up to, but I want you out. Told him to get out, and he did.
Do you have any idea where he may have went?
No, not a clue.
She said he took his things and he left.
Lana insists she hasn't seen or heard from John since that night. And with no other leads on their suspect's location, investigators are back at square one.
They start to intensify their efforts to find him because the clock is ticking.
As an investigator, you need to get to John as soon as possible.
Police reached out to law enforcement agencies in the surrounding areas to be on the lookout for John. They also enlisted the aid of the U.S. Marshals to help look for him.
Soon, their efforts pay off.
Eventually, they got a tip that the truck had been seen in Miami.
The tip led them to an apartment complex where they found the truck parked outside.
And inside the truck, police make an alarming discovery.
There's blood everywhere.
Based on the amount of blood, police believe that this may be where Vanessa was killed.
They found a green purse that they thought must have belonged to Vanessa, as well as a flip-flop that matched the one found at the body's dump site.
Now more than ever, investigators know they need to track down John Chapman.
Investigators go door to door looking for John Chapman. They don't find him anywhere. But what they do discover is near to that apartment complex is a homeless shelter.
Inside the homeless shelter, police finally locate John.
As he's getting dressed, they take him into custody. The police have their man.
Back in Palm Beach, detectives are eager to sit down with their number one suspect.
They immediately started peppering him with questions about what had happened to Vanessa, and to their surprise, he didn't hold back.
Vanessa was, she wasn't herself at all. I had to kill her.
John finally confessed to the murder.
But that's not all he says.
He tells them that it was in self-defense. He said she attacked him with a knife.
I believe that she was possessed by some demon.
Palm Beach County detectives have finally arrested John Chapman for the murder of his 28-year-old girlfriend, Vanessa Williams.
They take him into custody, and they start to question him.
Now in the interrogation room, John has just made a stunning confession.
She wasn't herself at all. I had to kill her.
He tells them that it was in self-defense.
I would hate to say that I'm a spiritual person, but I believe that she was possessed by some demon.
John tells the investigators it all started when he went to see Vanessa at Corey Summers' house on the night of April 18th.
Let's start with what led to this. Drugs?
He showed up at Corey's place to discuss their relationship and found her out of her mind on drugs.
When I got there, I realized that there was a lot of meth in the carpet.
Vanessa, what the hell are you doing?
He found Vanessa Williams searching the carpet for Flocka flakes.
He said now that he realized how deep an addiction she is, he realizes that he no longer wants to be with Vanessa.
John, can you help me?
He says it disgusted him that Vanessa Williams' drug use was so out of control.
John tells detectives he was ready to leave soon after arriving, but he was stranded.
He'd gotten dropped off at Corey's house, so he needed a ride back home.
I just wanted that ride back to Cape Coral. And I'm like, hey, let's have fun. Let's go ahead and let's head back to Cape Coral. Let's party.
When you say that, with drugs, everything?
Yeah.
John, with his narcissistic personality, realized that Vanessa was battling an addiction, and he was using that to control her.
On the drive to Cape Coral, the couple stopped to get some fast food. But as the sun set and they finished their meal, they got into a tense argument in the restaurant parking lot.
John was upset with Vanessa about her drug use, and Vanessa was upset with John in regards to the way he had been treating her in the relationship.
She's cursing at me, telling me, you ain't like this, you got that.
Eventually, John says he had enough.
I really just wanted her to feel what I felt. I don't know how else to say it. I just really, I pulled her hair, and it was just gonna be like a tussle.
Right.
But what I didn't notice that she had in the truck was a little small knife.
He said she tried to attack him.
He had to wrestle the knife away from her.
When she went for that, I hit her right on top of the head. Okay. And I was like, don't you dare do that. And then, honestly, I snapped.
He became completely overwhelmed with rage.
It was quick and it was insane.
You know how many times you snapped? More than once?
The problem with that story is as soon as he got the knife away from her, there was no threat anymore. You don't go back and plunge it 20 other more times in her chest after you take control of the knife.
And instead of getting help, he dumped her body on the side of a remote road where he thought that no one would be able to tie the crime back to him.
John blames his military experience for the extreme violence of his attack.
John is claiming he went into defense mode as though he was still in the military.
My training kicks in. Okay. All the emotions locked into robotic.
My army training kicked in. It's not an excuse to kill someone. Besides that, John admitted he started the physical altercation. So in reality, Vanessa was the one defending herself when she grabbed that knife.
John Chapman, at the end of their investigation, was booked and charged for murder.
At trial in January of 2018, the jury agrees with investigators. John's murder of Vanessa can't be chalked up to self-defense.
In the end, his self-defense was not bought by the jury. They found him guilty of second-degree murder, and the judge sentenced him to 48 years in prison.
John was very lucky that he was not sentenced to death and that he wound up being convicted with second-degree murder. That was because in the state of Florida, if it's a crime of passion, you can get second-degree murder.
Vanessa Williams will never get the chance to see what her future might have been, all because of the rage of John Chapman.
Vanessa was trying to turn her life around and have a better future for herself and her children.
Vanessa may not have been the perfect person, but she was really doing her best and trying to get back to a good place.
John Chapman was deceiving to many, and unfortunately, he deceived Vanessa Williams into thinking he was a good and decent person, someone she could build a family with, someone she should have a relationship with. And unfortunately, it cost her her life.
The highway never remembers the names of the people who pass through it. Every night, thousands of headlights sweep across the asphalt like rivers of pale light, carrying strangers toward homes, truck stops, forgotten motels, and destinations that seem certain until they suddenly aren't. In Florida, during the closing months of 1989, those endless roads stretched beneath warm skies and whispering pine trees, appearing no different from any other American highway. Cars continued to roll through the darkness. Neon signs continued to flicker outside gas stations. Cashiers poured coffee into paper cups for exhausted travelers. Somewhere, radios played familiar songs that dissolved into static as vehicles disappeared deeper into the night. Life kept moving. Nobody imagined that hidden between those miles of empty pavement and dense woodland, a story was unfolding that would become one of the most debated criminal cases in modern American history. At first, there was no monster in the headlines. There was only silence. A man failed to return home. Another disappeared after setting out on what should have been an ordinary trip. Families waited for phone calls that never came. Employers assumed someone had simply decided not to show up. Friends wondered if plans had changed. Across Florida, missing adults were not uncommon. Highways swallowed people every day. Cars broke down. Travelers drifted. Some chose to disappear from lives they no longer wanted. It was a state built on movement, tourism, temporary jobs, and endless traffic. One missing person rarely became front-page news. But then another body appeared. Then another. Then another. Each discovery added another unanswered question to an investigation that refused to follow a simple pattern. The victims did not belong to the same town. They did not work together. They were different ages, different occupations, different personalities. Yet each had traveled roads where strangers often met for only a few minutes before vanishing into the darkness together. The forests became unwilling witnesses. The dirt shoulders beside isolated highways became places where deputies stepped carefully through crushed leaves and broken branches, searching for evidence hidden beneath Florida's humid air. Every footprint could disappear beneath the next rainfall. Every tire mark could be erased by passing vehicles. Time itself seemed determined to protect whoever was responsible. Investigators would eventually discover a trail that crossed counties, connected stolen vehicles, pawn shops, fingerprints, and countless fragments that individually meant almost nothing but together formed a picture few could have predicted. At the center of that picture stood a woman. Not a criminal mastermind hiding behind wealth or influence. Not someone living behind the walls of a luxurious home. Not someone who inspired fear simply by entering a room. She lived on the edges of society, surviving from one day to the next, sleeping wherever she could, moving from motel to roadside campgrounds, existing in places most people drove past without ever slowing down. Her life had become almost invisible long before the country learned her name. That name was Eileen Wuornos. Even decades later, her story continues to divide people who study crime, psychology, and justice. Some see only the undeniable facts left behind by 7 dead men and the evidence presented in court. Others look beyond the verdict and ask difficult questions about trauma, survival, mental illness, violence, and whether a lifetime of abuse can alter the way a person perceives danger. Those questions have never erased the suffering of the victims or the pain carried by their families. They have simply ensured that this case remains far more complicated than a headline calling someone either purely evil or entirely misunderstood. Because this is not merely the story of a serial killer. It is also the story of ordinary people whose lives ended on lonely highways. It is the story of detectives forced to assemble a puzzle with pieces scattered across an entire state. It is the story of courtroom battles where facts, emotion, and competing narratives collided before juries asked to make irreversible decisions. And perhaps most unsettling of all, it is the story of how desperation, violence, and isolation can intersect in ways that leave no true winners behind. Long before television cameras surrounded courtrooms and reporters competed for exclusive interviews, there was only another evening settling over central Florida. The air remained warm long after sunset. Insects filled the darkness with invisible movement. Pickup trucks and sedans shared stretches of highway bordered by thick forests where moonlight barely reached the ground. Gas stations glowed like islands separated by miles of emptiness. Truck drivers stopped for coffee before continuing through the night. Travelers stretched their legs beneath fluorescent lights without realizing they stood only a short drive away from places where investigators would later search for evidence. Everything looked ordinary. That is often how history begins. Not with alarms. Not with dramatic warnings. Only with another day that feels exactly like yesterday. The people who would eventually become victims had no reason to believe they were approaching the final chapters of their lives. They had routines, responsibilities, plans waiting beyond the horizon. Some were working. Some were traveling. Some simply happened to cross paths with a stranger whose own life had already become defined by instability and hardship. For investigators, the first challenge was recognizing that these deaths belonged to the same story. Florida covers hundreds of miles of highways cutting through cities, wetlands, forests, and coastlines. Local law enforcement agencies often focused on crimes occurring within their own jurisdictions. A homicide discovered near one county road might initially appear unrelated to another death found hours away. Before computers rapidly shared information across departments, connections depended upon patient detective work, communication, and persistence. Meanwhile, newspapers began reporting isolated discoveries. Readers saw individual tragedies. Very few saw a pattern. Patterns emerge slowly. They begin as coincidence. Then become possibility. Eventually they become impossible to ignore. By then, however, someone has usually paid a terrible price. Some serial murder investigations begin with obvious signatures, carefully staged crime scenes, or victims sharing unmistakable similarities. This investigation offered far fewer certainties. The locations varied. Circumstances differed. Evidence disappeared beneath weather, wildlife, and time. Detectives repeatedly found themselves asking whether they were investigating one offender or several unrelated killings connected only by chance. As weeks turned into months, uncertainty became its own burden. Every unanswered question increased the pressure. Every new victim suggested that whoever was responsible remained free. Communities rarely experience fear all at once. Fear arrives gradually, carried through conversations at kitchen tables, whispered across office break rooms, repeated inside police briefings, and eventually broadcast through evening news reports. 1 murder shocks. 2 concern. Several force people to change how they see familiar places. Roads that once represented freedom begin to feel different. Drivers glance into rearview mirrors more often. Families ask loved ones to call after arriving safely. Strangers become subjects of suspicion. Yet while anxiety spread across parts of Florida, another reality unfolded beyond public attention. Eileen Wuornos continued moving through the same highways, truck stops, motels, and isolated roads that had become part of her daily existence. She did not resemble the fictional villains often created in movies. She blended into environments occupied by people struggling to survive one day at a time. Those margins of society are frequently overlooked until violence forces everyone to pay attention. Looking back, it is tempting to imagine warning signs glowing brightly before every notorious crime. Reality is rarely so generous. Lives unravel quietly. Pain accumulates over years. Decisions made in seconds are often shaped by experiences stretching back decades. Understanding that process does not excuse murder. Neither does it erase accountability. But without understanding it, the story remains incomplete. This case demands that we hold 2 difficult truths in our minds at the same time. 7 men lost their lives. A woman who admitted killing them also carried a history marked by profound hardship and instability. The legal system ultimately judged the evidence, weighed the competing arguments, and reached its verdict. Yet public debate has continued long after the courtroom doors closed because people still struggle with the questions left behind. How much of the past explains the present? When does fear become violence? Can trauma distort perception without removing responsibility? And how should justice respond when human suffering exists on every side of a case? Those questions will follow every chapter of this story. They will appear beside crime scene photographs and courtroom testimony. They will surface in interviews, psychiatric evaluations, investigative reports, and appeals. They will remain long after the final sentence is handed down. Before we examine the evidence, before we meet the investigators who slowly connected scattered clues, before we enter the courtrooms where every decision carried enormous weight, we must return to the beginning. Not to the moment of arrest. Not to the headlines. But to the years before America knew the name Aileen Wuornos, when the foundations of this extraordinary and deeply troubling case were already taking shape in ways almost no one could see. Florida has always been a place of contradictions. Under the bright postcards of white beaches, palm trees, and endless sunshine lies another landscape that tourists rarely remember. Beyond the crowded attractions, the highways stretch for hundreds of miles through pine forests, marshes, abandoned service roads, and isolated truck stops where strangers cross paths without ever learning each other's names. It is a state built on movement. People arrive chasing opportunity, warmer weather, second chances, or simply somewhere to disappear. Others leave just as quietly, taking their stories with them. During the late 1980s, these roads carried thousands of travelers every day. Salesmen drove between appointments. Retirees explored new towns. Truck drivers crossed the state before dawn. Local workers finished late shifts and headed home beneath skies that never seemed completely dark. Every passing vehicle represented another ordinary life moving forward. Few imagined that those same highways would soon become connected by a series of murders that would leave investigators searching for answers across multiple counties. To understand how that story unfolded, it is necessary to understand the woman standing at its center. Aileen Carol Wuornos entered the world on February 29, 1956, in Rochester, Michigan, long before anyone could imagine the notoriety her name would one day carry. The circumstances surrounding her birth already reflected instability. Her parents' relationship had collapsed before she had the chance to know what a family was supposed to feel like. Her father, Leo Dale Pittman, had a history of violent criminal behavior and was later diagnosed with schizophrenia. He was imprisoned before Aileen ever met him, and he would die behind bars years later. She never had the opportunity to form memories of him. Instead, the idea of a father existed only as a shadow built from stories, court records, and absence. Her mother, Diane Wuornos, was still a teenager herself. Raising two young children alone proved overwhelming. Eventually, Aileen and her older brother were left in the care of their maternal grandparents. Whether that decision came from desperation or necessity, it marked the beginning of a childhood defined by instability rather than security. From the outside, the family home appeared ordinary enough. Neighbors saw another modest house in suburban Michigan. Children played nearby. Lawns were mowed. Cars came and went. But behind closed doors, according to numerous accounts reported years later, life was far more turbulent. Family relationships were strained. Discipline was often harsh. Affection was inconsistent. The emotional foundation that many children rely upon simply never developed in a healthy way. Childhood memories shape how people understand safety. For some children, safety is the sound of parents laughing downstairs while they fall asleep. For others, safety becomes the rare moment when no one is shouting. As Aileen grew older, school offered little refuge. Teachers observed behavioral problems. She struggled academically and socially. Other children often viewed her as different, awkward, unpredictable. While classmates gradually built friendships and imagined futures, Aileen increasingly drifted toward isolation. Those who later studied her life would describe a young girl carrying emotional burdens far heavier than anyone her age should have been expected to bear. Biographers and court records describe allegations of abuse and neglect during her childhood. Some claims remain impossible to verify completely after so many years, while others were supported by family testimony and later evaluations. What is clear is that multiple professionals who examined her history agreed that her early years were marked by profound instability, trauma, and deprivation. Those experiences became an important part of later discussions about her mental health, though they did not alter her legal responsibility for the murders she would eventually admit committing. By adolescence, her life had become increasingly chaotic. She reportedly spent long hours away from home, wandering neighborhoods, sleeping wherever she could, and associating with people much older than herself. Stability became something she observed in other families rather than experienced herself. Home no longer represented comfort. School offered little direction. The future seemed less like a destination and more like another uncertain day waiting to arrive. Eventually, she left school without graduating. There was no celebration marking the beginning of adulthood. No carefully planned career. No supportive family helping her take the next step. Only survival. Over the following years, Eileen drifted across different states, supporting herself through temporary jobs whenever possible. She worked in kitchens, cleaned rooms, and accepted whatever employment could provide enough money to continue moving. But steady work rarely lasted. Financial hardship repeatedly pushed her back toward homelessness. The America of the late 20th century offered countless opportunities for some people. For others, every opportunity seemed to vanish just before they reached it. Life on the road became increasingly familiar. Cars replaced permanent addresses. Cheap motels replaced bedrooms. Campgrounds replaced neighborhoods. Florida eventually became the place where she settled, if surviving from one temporary location to another could truly be called settling. The state's warm climate made living outdoors more bearable than northern winters. Seasonal employment attracted people searching for work. Highways connected tourist destinations, trucking routes, and communities where cash transactions happened every hour of every day. For someone struggling to survive without financial security, those roads became both workplace and home. By the late 1980s, Eileen was working as a sex worker along highways throughout central Florida. The work placed her in constant contact with strangers. Most encounters lasted only minutes before each person disappeared back into anonymity. Drivers rarely shared real names. Cash exchanged hands. Vehicles disappeared into the night. Tomorrow brought different faces. It was an existence built almost entirely upon uncertainty. Every approaching car represented possibility. It also represented risk. Sex workers frequently experience violence at rates far exceeding the general population. Assaults often go unreported because victims fear arrest, stigma, or simply believe nobody will take their complaints seriously. During that era especially, many crimes against sex workers received limited public attention. This broader reality forms an important part of the context surrounding Warnos's later claims of self-defense. However, while the dangers of sex work were well documented, the courts ultimately concluded that the evidence in her individual cases did not justify the killings as lawful self-defense. Some nights ended with enough money to afford food in a motel room. Other nights ended with sleeping outdoors beneath the same stars that watched over passing motorists. The distance between surviving and not surviving could be measured in a single customer. During this period, Eileen met Tyria Moore, a hotel maid from Ohio. Their relationship quickly became one of the most significant emotional connections in Eileen's adult life. Friends described Eileen as deeply attached to Moore, often expressing affection in ways that suggested she had finally found the sense of belonging that had eluded her for years. For a brief moment, her life appeared to gain direction. The two women spent much of their time together, traveling across Florida, staying in inexpensive motels, visiting bars, and moving between temporary accommodations. Money remained scarce. When funds ran low, Eileen returned to highway prostitution while Moore often remained elsewhere, waiting for her to come back. The contrast between those two worlds could not have been sharper. One offered companionship. The other demanded constant vigilance. Each evening began with uncertainty. Every stranger entering a vehicle represented an unknown story. Some customers were polite. Others were intoxicated. Some simply wanted company during long drives. Others carried tempers, weapons, or intentions impossible to predict. Trust became a luxury that survival rarely allowed. People who later attempted to understand Eileen Wuornos often searched for a single moment when everything changed, as though one event alone transformed an ordinary person into someone capable of repeated homicide. Reality is rarely that simple. Human behavior develops through countless experiences accumulating over years. Trauma, poverty, mental illness, rejection, and repeated exposure to violence can shape perception in profound ways. None of those factors inevitably produce murder. Millions of people endure unimaginable hardship without committing violent crimes. Yet when investigators, psychologists, and historians later examined Wuornos's life, they found a pattern of instability stretching back almost to birth. Her world had long been defined by unpredictability. She rarely knew where she would sleep next week. She rarely knew whether she would have enough money tomorrow. She rarely knew whether the stranger opening a passenger door would leave her unharmed. Those circumstances do not explain away the crimes that followed. They do, however, help explain why this case continues to provoke discussion decades after the verdicts. By 1989, Florida itself was changing. Tourism continued to grow. Retirement communities expanded. Interstate highways carried more travelers than ever before. Law enforcement agencies faced increasing workloads across rapidly developing counties. Communication between jurisdictions was improving but remained slower than modern investigators would consider routine. Information often traveled through phone calls, mailed reports, and personal relationships rather than instant digital databases. In that environment, isolated crimes could remain isolated longer than they might today. A homicide discovered in one county might not immediately be linked to another discovered hours away. Patterns required patience. And patience often came at a terrible cost. As summer faded into autumn during 1989, few people noticed anything unusual about the woman occasionally seen standing beside Florida highways. She blended into the margins of society where countless others struggled with homelessness, addiction, poverty, or transient work. Passing motorists saw only another anonymous figure hoping someone would stop. No newspaper photographer followed her movements. No television reporter recognized her face. No detective considered her the focus of an expanding investigation. She remained, in every practical sense, invisible. Yet invisible people can leave very visible consequences. Within weeks, ordinary travel routes would become future crime scenes. Routine missing person reports would evolve into homicide investigations. Families would begin waiting beside telephones that never rang. And the woman whose life had unfolded almost entirely beyond public attention would become the subject of one of the most controversial criminal cases in American history, forcing investigators, psychologists, attorneys, journalists, and the public to confront questions that remain unsettled even decades later. The highways were still busy. The forests were still quiet. The night still looked ordinary. But beneath that appearance, the first threads of an extraordinary tragedy were already beginning to tighten. Every homicide investigation begins with a question that can never truly be answered. Who was this person before they became a case file? Long before detectives collected photographs, examined evidence, or stood beside silent stretches of Florida woodland, 7 men were living ordinary lives. They were fathers, sons, co-workers, friends, neighbors. They had routines that felt permanent, conversations they expected to continue, and plans that stretched into futures they believed they would have the chance to reach. None of them knew that an ordinary day would eventually become the final chapter of their lives. When history remembers a notorious criminal, the victims are often reduced to a list of names spoken in rapid succession. Their ages are mentioned. Their occupations appear briefly. Then the story returns to the person responsible. It is an unfortunate pattern that quietly steals something from those who lost everything. To understand this case honestly, the victims deserve more than a passing mention. They deserve to be remembered as people whose lives existed long before they crossed paths with Eileen Wuornos. Richard Mallory was 51 years old. He had lived a life that was neither glamorous nor extraordinary, the kind of life shared by countless working Americans. He earned a living, paid bills, and traveled the highways that connected one destination to another. Friends described him as someone accustomed to long drives and independent routines. Like many adults who spent significant time on the road, he had become comfortable with solitude. Miles of highway no longer felt lonely. They simply became part of everyday life. Late in November 1989, he disappeared. At first, there was no immediate reason for widespread concern. Adults occasionally changed plans. Travelers experienced vehicle problems. Unexpected delays happened every day. Hours became a day. A day became several. The silence gradually became impossible to ignore. Weeks later, his body was discovered in a wooded area of Volusia County. The scene told investigators only part of the story. He had suffered multiple gunshot wounds. Nature had already begun reclaiming the place where his life ended. Fallen leaves covered portions of the ground. Trees stood motionless above investigators as they carefully searched for evidence that might survive weather, time, and wildlife. Every step required patience. Every recovered fragment mattered. But crime scenes rarely explain why. They reveal what happened. Rarely what preceded it. Mallory's death would later become the most controversial killing in the entire case. During questioning and throughout legal proceedings, Wuornos claimed that he had sexually assaulted or attempted to sexually assault her before she shot him. Investigators examined the available evidence, but no physical proof survived that could conclusively establish exactly what happened during their encounter. Prosecutors argued that the killing was motivated by robbery rather than self-defense. The courts ultimately rejected the claim of lawful self-defense, but the unanswered questions surrounding that first homicide have continued to fuel debate for decades. Regardless of those unresolved arguments, one fact remained beyond dispute. A man had lost his life. And a family had lost someone they loved. Months later, another family would experience the same unimaginable uncertainty. David Spears was 43 years old. He worked in construction, a profession demanding long hours beneath Florida's relentless sun. Those who knew him remembered someone accustomed to physical labor, someone whose days were measured not by office meetings but by completed projects and exhausted evenings. Like thousands of workers across the state, he spent time traveling between jobs and communities. When communications suddenly stopped, concern slowly replaced routine. His body was eventually discovered in a remote area. Again, investigators faced familiar questions. Who had last seen him alive? Where had he traveled? Who knew his plans? The answers arrived slowly, scattered among witness statements and incomplete timelines. Every homicide forces families into an impossible rhythm. First comes confusion. Then hope. Then fear. Finally, confirmation. No investigator ever forgets the moment relatives are informed that hope is over. Behind every notification is a living room that becomes permanently associated with unbearable news. A kitchen table where someone sits without speaking. A telephone that suddenly feels heavy enough to change an entire lifetime. The headlines rarely describe those moments. Yet they become the moments families remember forever. Charles Cascadon was 40 years old. Friends knew him as someone who enjoyed traveling and spending time outdoors. His disappearance followed a pattern investigators were beginning to recognize, although they still could not prove the deaths were connected. Another body. Another remote location. Another life abruptly interrupted. By now, detectives from different jurisdictions had begun comparing information more carefully. Similarities were emerging, though certainty remained elusive. Victims were adult men. Several had last been seen driving alone. Property was missing after the killings. Firearms had been used. Individually, none of those details guaranteed a connection. Together, they suggested possibility. Investigators understand that coincidence exists. But so do patterns. Learning to distinguish one from the other often determines whether a case remains unsolved or eventually reaches a courtroom. Then there was Peter Seams. His story remains unique because his body was never found. He was 65 years old and had been traveling through Florida when he vanished. Unlike the other victims, investigators never recovered his remains. Instead, much of the evidence centered around his missing vehicle and the circumstances surrounding his disappearance. The absence of a body complicated every aspect of the investigation. Without a crime scene, detectives relied more heavily upon witness testimony, physical evidence connected to the vehicle, and later admissions made by Wuornos herself. For families, the absence of a body creates a different kind of grief. There is no final place where certainty begins. No complete explanation. Only unanswered questions stretching across years. Some relatives continue imagining impossible alternatives simply because the mind struggles to accept an ending it cannot see. Even when legal proceedings establish responsibility, emotional closure often remains beyond reach. As investigators continued assembling timelines, another name entered the growing list. Troy Barres was 50 years old. His disappearance eventually led detectives toward another abandoned vehicle and another series of unanswered questions. The highways connecting Central Florida had become more than transportation routes. They had become silent witnesses. Gas stations remembered faces only briefly. Cashiers served hundreds of customers every week. Truck stops welcomed travelers who blended together into an endless procession of strangers. Someone could arrive, disappear into the night, and leave almost no trace beyond a receipt and fading memory. Modern surveillance cameras were far less common than they are today. Digital records were limited. Investigators relied heavily upon interviews, physical evidence, and persistence. Charles Humphreys, 56 years old, also became one of the victims whose death formed part of the prosecution's case. He had served in the military earlier in life before building a civilian career. Friends described him as dependable and hardworking. Like every victim in this investigation, he possessed a history extending far beyond the brief paragraphs later devoted to him in newspaper coverage. Each victim had birthdays, favorite meals, people who expected to see them again, family photographs tucked inside albums, conversations left unfinished, vacant chairs at holiday gatherings. These details rarely appear inside courtroom exhibits. Yet they represent the true cost of violent crime. Statistics count deaths. Families live with absences. The final confirmed victim was Walter Antonio. At 62 years old, he had reached an age when many people begin imagining quieter years ahead. Instead, his life ended beside one of the highways that had become central to the investigation. By the time investigators connected the deaths, the pattern could no longer be dismissed. Someone was targeting men traveling alone. The killings had occurred over approximately 1 year. Property belonging to victims had disappeared. Evidence increasingly suggested that the same offender was responsible. Still, detectives knew patterns alone never secure convictions. Evidence does. Every recovered fingerprint mattered. Every witness statement mattered. Every receipt, pawn transaction, and vehicle recovery became another piece of a puzzle slowly taking shape. Meanwhile, outside police stations and forensic laboratories, families attempted to continue living with impossible loss. Birthdays arrived without phone calls. Anniversaries passed in silence. Children asked questions that adults struggled to answer. Grief rarely follows a straight path. Some people seek justice immediately. Others simply wish for one more ordinary conversation. No investigation can return what has been taken. The best it can offer is truth. Or at least the closest approximation of truth that evidence allows. One of the lasting challenges in discussing the Warnos case is balancing two realities that often compete for attention. Her personal history was undeniably marked by profound hardship. The victims' lives were undeniably cut short. Acknowledging one should never require minimizing the other. The legal system was asked to evaluate actions, evidence, and intent rather than compare suffering. That distinction became critically important as prosecutors and defense attorneys later presented sharply different narratives about what had happened on Florida's highways. For the families of the victims, however, those legal arguments existed alongside a far simpler reality. Someone they loved never came home. No verdict could restore birthdays missed over decades. No prison sentence could repair empty places within families. Justice can establish accountability. It cannot erase grief. As the number of victims increased, investigators recognized that they were no longer confronting isolated tragedies. They were pursuing someone capable of repeated lethal violence, someone who continued moving across Florida while ordinary people unknowingly shared the same highways. Each passing week raised another frightening possibility. If the killer remained unidentified, there could be another victim. Another family waiting beside a telephone. Another stretch of woodland transformed into a crime scene. The investigation was becoming larger than any single county could easily manage. Somewhere, scattered across pawn slips, witness recollections, abandoned vehicles, and forensic evidence, lay the thread capable of connecting every death. Detectives simply had to find it before another life was added to the growing list of names that deserve to be remembered for far more than the tragic way their stories ended. The first time violence enters a person's life, it is often remembered in fragments. A glance that suddenly changes. A voice becoming sharper than expected. A hand moving faster than the mind can react. A heartbeat that seems impossibly loud. No investigation can completely reconstruct what happened inside a moving vehicle on a deserted Florida highway during the final moments before a trigger was pulled. The people who were there are no longer able to tell the same story. One side of every encounter died at the scene. The other survived to offer an account that investigators, prosecutors, defense attorneys, and juries would spend years examining, questioning, and debating. What remains are physical facts, timelines, forensic evidence, witness testimony, and admissions made after the crimes. Everything else exists within the uncertainty that so often surrounds violent death. The closing weeks of November 1989 brought cool evenings to parts of central Florida. Daylight still carried warmth, but darkness arrived with damp air drifting through long stretches of pine forest. Highways remained busy, connecting cities, beaches, truck stops, and small communities separated by miles of open road. Drivers passed one another without exchanging so much as a glance. Every passing vehicle represented a stranger with a destination. Somewhere along one of those roads, Richard Mallory encountered Eileen Warnos. Exactly how their conversation began has never been independently verified. Like many encounters between sex workers and customers during that era, it almost certainly began as a brief exchange between strangers brought together by circumstance. Cash would have been discussed. A destination chosen. The passenger door closed. The vehicle pulled back onto the highway. From that point forward, certainty disappears. Warnos later claimed that Mallory sexually assaulted or attempted to sexually assault her and that she shot him because she believed her life was in immediate danger. Prosecutors argued that the evidence instead supported a robbery that ended in murder. Because there were no surviving eyewitnesses and no conclusive physical evidence capable of confirming every detail of the encounter, the precise sequence of events remains unknown. After reviewing the available evidence, the courts rejected the legal claim of self-defense and convicted Warnos of murder. Whatever happened inside that vehicle, it ended with multiple gunshots. When silence returned to the woods, one man was dead. Another life had crossed an irreversible line. In the days that followed, Mallory's vehicle disappeared. Personal belongings were missing. The road continued carrying thousands of travelers who had no idea a homicide investigation had quietly begun. If that first killing had remained an isolated event, history might remember it differently. It did not. Weeks passed. December arrived. Christmas decorations appeared outside homes and shopping centers across Florida. Families gathered for holiday meals. Children counted the days until gifts would be opened. Businesses prepared for tourists escaping colder northern states. Somewhere beyond those celebrations, another deadly encounter unfolded. Another man accepted a ride or offered one. Another journey ended somewhere far from witnesses. Again, investigators would eventually recover a body bearing gunshot wounds. Again, property connected to the victim disappeared. At first, similarities seemed limited. Florida investigated hundreds of violent crimes every year. Not every shooting belonged to the same offender. Yet detectives are trained to notice repetition. Firearms. Remote locations. Adult male victims. Missing vehicles. The pattern remained incomplete, but it was beginning to emerge. For Eileen Warnos, life continued much as it had before. She and Tyria Moore moved between inexpensive motels, campgrounds, and temporary accommodations. Money rarely lasted long. Whenever it ran out, Warnos returned to the highways, searching for customers among travelers stopping for fuel, food, or rest before continuing their journeys. To passing motorists, she remained anonymous. Another woman standing beside the road. Another stranger trying to survive. Nothing about her appearance suggested that investigators in multiple counties would eventually search for her. Nothing warned the next victim. As winter turned toward spring, violence returned. David Spears disappeared. Like the others before him, his final movements became a puzzle assembled after he could no longer explain them himself. Investigators traced known locations, interviewed acquaintances, and attempted to establish timelines from receipts, witness recollections, and routine daily activities. Every homicide investigation begins by moving backward through time. Where was the victim last seen? Who spoke with them? Who expected them home? The closer detectives moved toward the final hours, the fewer reliable answers they found. Again, gunfire ended a life. Again, another family entered the terrible uncertainty between hope and confirmation. The bodies were not discovered immediately. Florida's forests conceal more than people imagine. Dense undergrowth swallows abandoned objects. Seasonal rains erase footprints. Animals disturb evidence. Days can pass before someone hiking, hunting, or working in remote areas notices something unusual. Time rarely favors investigators. It almost always favors whoever leaves first. As additional victims were discovered throughout 1990, one disturbing truth became increasingly apparent. These were not spontaneous public shootings. There were no crowded crime scenes. No panicked eyewitnesses describing a fleeing suspect. Each encounter unfolded in isolation. Two people entered the final moments. Only one left alive. Charles Cascadon became another victim. Then Peter Seams disappeared. Unlike the others, investigators never recovered his body. Instead, his missing vehicle became one of the most significant pieces of evidence. The absence of remains complicated the investigation enormously. Without a body, detectives had to establish death through surrounding circumstances, physical evidence, and later admissions rather than forensic examination alone. Even so, the emerging pattern refused to disappear. Vehicles vanished after victims disappeared. Property changed hands. Life continued for everyone else. One of the unsettling realities of serial homicide investigations is how ordinary the days between killings often appear. The offender buys food, stops for gasoline, sleeps, talks to people, walks through stores unnoticed. Meanwhile, detectives remain unaware that future evidence is already being created. Receipts are printed. Fingerprints are left behind. Witnesses observe encounters that seem completely unimportant until months later. History hides itself inside ordinary moments. By the summer of 1990, investigators still lacked the single breakthrough capable of connecting every crime. Individual sheriff's offices pursued individual cases. Reports accumulated. Evidence lockers filled. Medical examiners documented injuries with careful precision. Each recovered bullet, photograph, and fingerprint waited for the moment another investigator would recognize its significance. While law enforcement searched for answers, Warnos and more continued traveling. Friends who occasionally encountered them later described financial struggles, frequent movement, and an existence defined by uncertainty. There was little stability. 1 week might bring enough money for motel rooms and restaurant meals. The next could end with sleeping outdoors. That instability forms part of the historical record. It does not, however, answer the central question that would later dominate the trials. Why were the men killed? Warnos consistently maintained that she feared for her life during the encounters. Prosecutors argued that robbery motivated the crimes and pointed to the theft of vehicles and personal property as evidence supporting that conclusion. Because each victim died alone with Warnos, no independent witness could resolve those competing accounts. The legal process would ultimately examine physical evidence rather than speculation. During this period, another fatal encounter claimed the life of Troy Burress. Then came Charles Humphreys. Finally, Walter Antonio. 7 men. Approximately 1 year. Multiple counties. Each death deepened the investigation while simultaneously increasing public concern. Families searched for explanations that did not exist. Communities wondered whether the killings were connected. Law enforcement agencies quietly expanded cooperation across jurisdictions. The highways themselves remained unchanged. Morning commuters still hurried toward work. Vacationers stopped for photographs near beaches. Truck drivers logged another 1,000 miles. The same roads carried ordinary people alongside extraordinary violence without revealing which journey would end safely. For investigators, frustration grew heavier with every passing month. Evidence existed. But evidence scattered across different counties rarely reveals its full meaning until someone gathers every piece together. The killer had not vanished without leaving traces. Those traces simply remained separated by distance. Each crime scene produced fragments. A shell casing. A tire impression. Missing property. Witnesses remembering vehicles seen weeks earlier. No single clue solved the investigation. The solution would emerge only when dozens of seemingly unrelated details were finally placed beside one another. Looking back from the perspective of history, it is tempting to believe the pattern should have been obvious from the beginning. It rarely works that way. Investigations unfold in real time. Detectives cannot see future evidence. They cannot know another body will soon be discovered in a different county. They must work only with what exists that day. That reality explains why serial investigations often appear slower than the public expects. Connections require patience. Patience demands time. Time sometimes allows another crime. For the families, however, those distinctions mattered little. Whether detectives connected one homicide or 7, someone they loved was already gone. Birthdays passed without celebration. Telephone numbers remained stored inside address books long after they would never again be answered. Cars sat unused in driveways. Closets still held jackets waiting for owners who would never return. Violent crime creates two timelines. One belongs to investigators measuring evidence. The other belongs to families measuring absence. By the autumn of 1990, both timelines were moving toward the same inevitable destination. Somewhere among stolen vehicles, pawned belongings, fingerprints, eyewitness observations, and countless pages of investigative reports, the identity of the killer was waiting to be uncovered. The murders had transformed isolated highways into scenes of fear. The victims had become linked by tragedy. The investigation had become too large to remain fragmented. Detectives did not yet know the name they were searching for. But they were closer than they realized. The next clue would not come from another body hidden beside a lonely Florida road. It would come from the ordinary mistakes that even the most elusive offenders eventually make, mistakes that would begin unraveling a year of violence and bring investigators face to face with the woman whose story would ignite one of the most enduring debates in the history of American true crime. The first moments after a body is discovered are often the quietest. Before the headlines. Before the courtroom arguments. Before investigators know the victim's name or understand the scale of what they are facing. There is only a location. A place where something terrible happened and where the ordinary rhythm of life has been interrupted. In Florida during the late 1980s and early 1990s, many of these places looked almost identical from a distance. Roads stretched through areas where trees grew thick and close together. Empty shoulders disappeared into grass and dirt. Beyond the pavement were stretches of land where a person could stand only a short distance away from passing traffic and still feel completely separated from the world. These landscapes were common. They were not designed to reveal secrets. They were designed to hide them. When investigators arrived at these locations, they were not walking into scenes that immediately explained themselves. There were no simple answers waiting beneath the trees. No witness standing nearby who could describe exactly what happened. Instead, detectives faced the difficult reality of homicide investigations. The victim could no longer speak, and every detail left behind had to be interpreted carefully. A body is not just evidence. It is a person who had a life before becoming part of an investigation. That understanding shaped the work of the detectives assigned to these cases. Behind every photograph taken at a scene was someone who had once been expected home. Behind every item collected into an evidence bag was an object that had belonged to a living person. The investigation into the deaths connected to Eileen Wuornos did not begin as one large case. At first, they were separate tragedies handled by different agencies. Different victims. Different locations. Different reports. That separation created one of the greatest challenges investigators faced. Serial offenders often depend on confusion. When crimes occur in different jurisdictions, information can remain divided. One department may have evidence that another department does not know exists. A vehicle recovered in one area may connect to a homicide discovered somewhere else. A witness who remembers a small detail may hold the missing piece of an investigation hundreds of miles away. In the beginning, investigators were working with fragments. The first major case involved Richard Mallory. When his body was discovered in December 1989 in Volusia County, detectives began examining every possible detail surrounding his disappearance and death. The location provided clues, but it also raised questions. Why had he been there? Who had been with him? How had he ended up in that particular area? The scene suggested violence. The circumstances suggested a crime that was not random. But the identity of the person responsible remained unknown. Investigators followed the standard path of homicide work. They examined the victim's last known movements. They spoke with people who knew him. They reviewed where he had been and who might have encountered him. They searched for connections between his disappearance and other missing persons reports. At this stage, there was no clear picture of a serial killer operating across Florida. There was only a dead man and a search for answers. Then more cases appeared. As additional victims were discovered, investigators began noticing similarities that could not be ignored. Several victims were found in remote areas. Several had suffered gunshot wounds. Several had their vehicles or belongings taken after their deaths. Each detail alone could have been explained. Together, they formed a disturbing possibility. Someone was selecting victims along the highways. Someone was moving through Florida leaving behind a trail that stretched across multiple counties. The challenge was proving that connection. In criminal investigations, suspicion is not enough. A detective can believe two crimes are connected. A prosecutor can believe the same person committed multiple offenses. But a courtroom requires evidence that survives questioning. Every theory must eventually confront facts. One of the most important developments came from the vehicles associated with the victims. Cars often become silent witnesses. They carry fingerprints. They carry personal belongings. They reveal where someone traveled. They sometimes show the final moments before a crime occurred. In the Warnos investigation, stolen vehicles became a significant part of the evidence trail. Vehicles connected investigators to locations, witnesses, and transactions that would later help establish a pattern. Another important area of investigation involved property taken from victims. Items that once belonged to missing men began appearing in places investigators could trace. Pawn shops became part of the investigation. Records that seemed insignificant at the time gained new importance. A person selling an item might not remember the transaction months later. But a receipt could. A record could. A fingerprint could. Modern audiences are accustomed to investigations involving instant digital searches and advanced databases. But in this period, detectives often relied on careful documentation and traditional police work. A small piece of paper could become the difference between uncertainty and a breakthrough. The investigation also began moving closer to Eileen Warnos through witnesses who remembered seeing her with victims or in possession of vehicles connected to them. At first, these observations seemed ordinary. A woman at a motel. A couple traveling together. A vehicle seen in a parking lot. Most people do not memorize details of strangers they pass during daily life. But when detectives return with questions after a crime has occurred, ordinary memories become important. What color was the car? Who was inside? When did you see them? What did they say? Human memory is imperfect. But sometimes an imperfect memory becomes the bridge between a crime and its solution. As investigators continued gathering evidence, attention increasingly turned toward Warnos and Tyria Moore. Their relationship became an important part of understanding the timeline. Moore had traveled with Warnos and was one of the few people who knew her daily movements during the period when the killings occurred. Investigators believed that speaking with Moore could provide information that connected separate events together. The investigation was no longer searching for an unknown person. It was beginning to focus on a specific individual. Yet even then, detectives still needed cooperation, evidence, and a legally reliable path forward. The discovery phase of any criminal investigation is not only about finding objects. It is about reconstructing a story. A person leaves home. A vehicle travels somewhere. A conversation happens. A decision is made. Minutes pass. A life ends. Investigators attempt to rebuild those missing moments from what remains afterward. In the Warnos case, the reconstruction became increasingly complicated because the central question was not only who committed the crimes. It was why. That question would dominate the legal battles that followed. The prosecution would argue that the evidence showed a pattern of robbery and murder. The defense would argue that Warnos believed she was defending herself from violent encounters. The physical evidence could establish many things. It could show where victims were found. It could connect weapons, vehicles, and property. It could place people near important events. But evidence does not always answer questions about fear, intention, or perception. Those questions would eventually move from police reports into courtrooms. Before that happened, however, investigators still had work to do. They needed to transform scattered discoveries into a single case. They needed to explain how 7 separate victims became connected. They needed to identify every piece of evidence that could withstand the pressure of trial. And most importantly, they needed to understand how a woman living on the margins of society had become connected to a series of deaths that had remained unsolved for so long. The answer would not come from one dramatic discovery. It would come from accumulation. One clue. One interview. One record. One recovered item. Until finally, the scattered pieces began forming an image that investigators could no longer ignore. Eileen Warnos was no longer just a person of interest. She was becoming the central figure in one of Florida's most controversial criminal investigations. Investigations rarely move in a straight line. From the outside, people often imagine detectives following a clear path from the first clue to the final arrest. They imagine every discovery leading naturally toward the answer, every interview revealing exactly what happened, every piece of evidence fitting perfectly into place. Reality is much more uncertain. A homicide investigation is a process of walking through darkness with only small points of light. Some clues lead somewhere. Others disappear completely. Some witnesses remember important details. Others provide information that creates more questions than answers. Investigators must constantly separate what matters from what only appears important. In the case that would eventually become known as the Eileen Warnos investigation, that process took months. The first challenge was simple but overwhelming. Who was responsible? At the beginning, detectives did not have a name. They had victims. They had crime scenes. They had missing vehicles and stolen property. But they did not yet have the person who connected everything. The victims came from different backgrounds. They lived different lives. They were discovered in different areas. There was no obvious relationship between them. That uncertainty created multiple possibilities. Could the killings be unrelated? Could several offenders be responsible? Was someone targeting people along Florida's highways? Or was there a pattern that investigators had not yet recognized? Every possibility had to be considered. A wrong assumption in the early stages of an investigation can cost valuable time. Detectives cannot simply decide on a theory and force every piece of evidence to fit. They have to allow the evidence to guide them, even when the direction is unclear. As the number of victims increased, the similarities became harder to dismiss. The victims were men traveling alone. Several had encountered the same unusual circumstances before their deaths. Vehicles and personal belongings were missing. The locations were isolated. The method of killing showed a disturbing consistency. The possibility of a serial offender became increasingly difficult to ignore. However, identifying a pattern and proving who created that pattern are two very different challenges. Investigators began looking deeper into the victims' final known movements. Who had they spoken with? Where had they stopped? Who had seen them last? These questions became the foundation of the investigation. A victim's final hours often contain the most important clues. A phone call, a receipt, a witness who remembers a face, or a stranger who noticed a vehicle can become the detail that changes everything. But those details do not always appear immediately. Sometimes they must be discovered. Sometimes they must be found by asking the same question repeatedly until someone remembers something they did not realize was important. During this investigation, detectives began examining connections between stolen property and individuals who had attempted to sell or exchange items belonging to victims. Pawn shops became an unexpected part of the story. For many people, a pawn transaction is an ordinary financial decision. A person brings in an item, receives money, and leaves. The employee records the information required by law. At the time, those records were simply routine paperwork. Later, they became evidence. A name written on a document. A description of an item. A date and location. Small details that seemed meaningless alone began creating a trail. Investigators were also examining vehicles connected to the victims. A car can reveal a surprising amount about what happened after someone disappeared. Where it was found. Who had access to it? What objects remained inside? What objects were missing? Every detail became another question. Eventually, attention began focusing on Eileen Wuornos. But identifying a possible suspect was only the beginning. Investigators needed to understand her connection to the victims. They needed to determine whether she was simply someone who had crossed paths with them or whether she was directly responsible for their deaths. The difference between suspicion and proof is the foundation of criminal justice. During this period, Wuornos continued living with Tyria Moore. Their relationship became a central part of the investigation because Moore was one of the few people who knew Wuornos' movements during the period of the killings. To investigators, Moore represented a potential link. Someone who could provide information about where Wuornos had been. Someone who could explain unusual events. Someone who might know what had happened. But speaking with a close partner in a criminal investigation is complicated. Loyalty can be powerful. Fear can be powerful. Love can influence decisions even when those decisions carry enormous consequences. Investigators understood that gaining Moore's cooperation could change the entire direction of the case. The challenge was convincing her to speak. Meanwhile, Wuornos herself became increasingly aware that law enforcement attention was moving closer. The life she had lived on the margins was becoming impossible to maintain. The highways that had once provided anonymity were now connected to a growing investigation. The vehicles she had driven. The places she had stayed. The transactions she had made. The people who had seen her. All of these details existed somewhere. The question was whether investigators could connect them in time. During interrogations and later legal proceedings, Wuornos offered her own explanation of events. She did not deny the shootings. Instead, she argued that the encounters had been acts of survival. She claimed that the men she killed had threatened her and that she believed she was in danger. This explanation became one of the most significant elements of the entire case. Because the investigation was not only about what happened. It was also about interpretation. The prosecution viewed the killings as deliberate acts committed for financial gain. They pointed to stolen property, missing vehicles, and the repeated nature of the crimes. The defense presented a different perspective, focusing on Wuornos' history of violence, exploitation, and her belief that she was protecting herself. These competing narratives would later dominate the courtroom. But before lawyers could argue over them, investigators needed to complete their work. They needed evidence. Not emotion. Not assumptions. Evidence. The investigation also revealed the difficulties of examining crimes committed against people who lived or traveled outside traditional social circles. Many victims of violent crime leave behind communities demanding answers immediately. Others become known only after tragedy. The men killed in this case were not famous. They were not public figures. Their names did not dominate national conversations before their deaths. But their lives mattered. Their families deserved answers. And investigators understood that solving the case was not simply about identifying an offender. It was about giving those families the truth about what happened. As detectives continued gathering information, the investigation gradually shifted from searching for possibilities to building a case. The unknown offender was becoming a specific person. The scattered crimes were becoming one connected timeline. The unanswered questions were beginning to receive answers. But the final breakthrough would not come from a dramatic discovery at a crime scene. It would come from a relationship, a conversation, and a decision made by someone who knew Eileen Wuornos better than almost anyone else. Tyria Moore. For investigators, she represented the final bridge between suspicion and certainty. For Wuornos, she represented the person she trusted most. That trust would soon become the key factor that changed everything. For months, investigators had been searching through fragments. A vehicle. A receipt. A witness memory. A missing person report. A piece of property connected to someone who would never return home. Each piece carried information, but none of them alone was enough to reveal the complete story. The investigation had moved slowly because the truth was buried beneath layers of uncertainty. Detectives knew that several deaths appeared connected. They had a growing suspicion about who might be responsible. But suspicion was not the same as proof. A courtroom does not accept a feeling. It demands evidence. By early 1991, investigators were closing in on Eileen Wuornos. The trail that had begun with scattered clues across Florida was now leading toward a single person. But the most important challenge remained. How could they prove what happened? The answer would come through the person closest to Wuornos. Tyria Moore. For years, Moore had been more than a companion. She was the person who shared Wuornos' unstable life on the road. She knew the motel rooms, the temporary stops, the difficult financial struggles, and the moments when Wuornos returned after encounters with strangers. To investigators, Moore represented something rare in a case like this. A person who might know the missing pieces. But Moore was not a detective. She was not a prosecutor. She was someone emotionally connected to the woman being investigated. That made her cooperation uncertain. Relationships do not disappear simply because a person becomes involved in a criminal investigation. Loyalty, fear, affection, and confusion often exist at the same time. Investigators understood that approaching Moore required patience. They needed information. But they also needed trust. As law enforcement pressure increased, Moore eventually agreed to cooperate with authorities. Her decision became the turning point that transformed the investigation from a collection of suspicions into a case built around direct evidence. The strategy was careful. Investigators wanted Wuornos to speak freely. They wanted her own words. Her own explanations. Her own understanding of what had happened. Through cooperation with authorities, Moore participated in conversations with Wuornos that were recorded. The purpose was to encourage Wuornos to discuss the killings and reveal information only the person responsible would likely know. For investigators, these conversations were critical. They were not simply searching for an admission. They were searching for confirmation. Details. Connections. Information that could be compared against the evidence already collected. During these conversations, Wuornos acknowledged responsibility for the shootings. The woman investigators had spent months trying to identify was no longer an unknown figure. The case had a center. A name. A voice. A person who could finally be confronted with the evidence. On January 9, 1991, Eileen Wuornos was arrested in Volusia County, Florida. The arrest marked the end of the uncertainty surrounding the investigation, but it did not end the questions surrounding the case. In many ways, the most difficult chapter was only beginning. Because capturing a suspect is one thing. Understanding the crime is another. After her arrest, investigators continued examining the evidence connected to the 7 victims. They reviewed timelines, recovered property, forensic findings, and statements. Every detail needed to be carefully organized because the prosecution would eventually have to prove multiple murders in court. The investigation had changed from a search into a preparation. The question was no longer, who did this? The question became, could the state prove exactly what happened? Wuornos's own statements created a complicated legal situation. She admitted the shootings. But she also insisted that she had acted out of fear. This distinction would become the central conflict of the trials. The prosecution argued that the pattern of events showed intentional murder. Their argument focused on several key points. The victims were killed during separate encounters. Their belongings and vehicles were taken afterward. The killings occurred over an extended period. According to prosecutors, these facts showed planning and financial motivation. The defense presented a different interpretation. They argued that Wuornos had spent much of her life exposed to violence and danger. They suggested that her experiences influenced how she perceived threats and that some encounters may have involved genuine fear for her safety. The difference between these two interpretations would determine her fate. Was she a person who deliberately hunted victims for money? Or was she someone who believed she was repeatedly fighting for survival? The evidence would be examined by judges and juries. But public opinion had already begun forming. The media quickly became fascinated by the case. A female serial killer was uncommon in public imagination. The image of a woman committing multiple murders challenged many assumptions about violent crime. Newspapers, television programs, and later documentaries examined every aspect of Wuornos's life. Her childhood. Her relationships. Her appearance. Her statements. Her crimes. Yet beneath the attention was a reality that remained unchanged. 7 men had died. 7 families had suffered losses that could not be reversed. The investigation's breakthrough brought answers, but it also brought a new wave of painful attention to the victims and their loved ones. For families, the arrest of a suspect can create conflicting emotions. There may be relief that the search has ended. There may be anger that it took so long. There may be grief returning with renewed intensity as details become public. Justice begins with discovering the truth, but truth can also reopen wounds. As investigators finalized their case, they continued examining every element connected to Wuornos. Her statements. Her movements. Her relationship with Moore. The property linked to victims. The physical evidence. The prosecution needed to present a story that explained not only who committed the crimes but how and why they happened. The defense needed to challenge that story. Every trial would require the jury to consider evidence from a different victim and a different set of circumstances. The legal process would be long. The public debate would be intense. And Eileen Wuornos would soon move from an investigative file into the center of one of the most closely watched criminal trials in America. The breakthrough had arrived. The investigation had found its answer. But the justice system still had to decide what that answer meant. A courtroom is a place where stories collide. Long before a jury enters the room, both sides begin constructing their versions of the past. Prosecutors gather evidence and arrange events into a timeline. Defense attorneys examine those same events and search for another interpretation. Witnesses revisit memories they may have tried to leave behind. Families sit quietly, carrying years of grief into a room where strangers will decide what justice should look like. For Eileen Wuornos, the courtroom would become the place where two completely different images of her life would be presented. To prosecutors, she was a serial murderer who targeted vulnerable men traveling through Florida, killing them and taking their belongings afterward. To the defense, she was a deeply damaged woman whose life had been shaped by years of violence, abandonment, and exploitation, leading her to believe she was constantly under threat. The jury was not asked to decide whether Wuornos had experienced hardship. They were asked to decide what she had done, why she had done it, and whether the evidence proved guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. The first major trial focused on the death of Richard Mallory. His killing had become the foundation of the investigation and one of the most debated parts of the entire case. When prosecutors presented their arguments, they emphasized the physical evidence and the circumstances surrounding the murder. They argued that Mallory's death was not an act of unavoidable survival but part of a larger pattern in which victims were killed and their property taken. The prosecution pointed to the aftermath of the killings. Vehicles had disappeared. Money and belongings had changed hands. Victims had been left behind while Wuornos continued moving through Florida. To prosecutors, these details revealed intent. They argued that the repeated nature of the crimes showed a deliberate pattern rather than isolated acts of panic. The defense presented a different picture. They did not deny that Wuornos had shot the victims. Instead, they focused on the circumstances surrounding those encounters. They argued that Wuornos's history had placed her in dangerous situations for years. As someone working on the margins of society, she had frequently encountered strangers whose intentions she could not predict. Her attorneys argued that her perception of danger had been shaped by repeated experiences of violence and fear. The defense wanted the jury to consider the person behind the crimes. Her childhood. Her unstable relationships. Her history of trauma. The years she spent struggling to survive. But the prosecution warned the jury not to confuse explanation with justification. A difficult past, they argued, could provide context. It could not excuse taking another person's life. This distinction became one of the central themes of the trial. The jury ultimately found Wuornos guilty of murdering Richard Mallory. The conviction marked the beginning of a series of legal proceedings that would determine her fate. Because each victim represented a separate case, prosecutors continued pursuing additional charges. Each trial brought new evidence. New testimony. New reminders of the lives lost. The courtroom repeatedly returned to the same painful question. What happened during those final moments between Wuornos and each victim? Without surviving witnesses, the jury had to rely on the evidence left behind. Investigators described how victims were connected to Wuornos through physical evidence and testimony. They explained the movements of vehicles and property. They presented statements made by Wuornos herself. The defense continued challenging the state's interpretation, arguing that the full circumstances surrounding each encounter mattered. But one by one, convictions followed. Wuornos was convicted in multiple murders connected to the 7 victims. The verdicts brought a sense of legal resolution. But they did not end the debate. Outside the courtroom, public opinion remained deeply divided. Some people viewed Wuornos as an example of a dangerous offender who had to be stopped. Others focused on the failures that surrounded her life before the crimes. They questioned how a person could experience years of instability, abuse, and neglect before eventually becoming one of the most infamous criminals in America. The debate was not about whether the victims deserved justice. They did. The debate centered on how society understands the path that leads someone toward extreme violence. Can a person's suffering explain their actions? Where should accountability begin? How should the justice system respond when a person has both experienced harm and caused devastating harm to others? These questions followed Wuornos throughout the remainder of her legal battles. Psychological evaluations became another important part of the case. During her time in custody, experts examined Warno's mental state. They evaluated her behavior, her statements, and her ability to understand the legal process. Mental health became a significant issue because capital cases require careful examination of a defendant's psychological condition. However, questions about mental illness and responsibility are complex. A diagnosis does not automatically determine whether someone is legally responsible for a crime. Courts must examine specific legal standards. In Warno's case, judges ultimately determined that she was competent to stand trial and understand the proceedings against her. The final phase of the legal process focused on punishment. The prosecution argued that the severity and number of the crimes justified the ultimate penalty. The defense argued for consideration of Warno's background, psychological condition, and life experiences. The jury's decisions reflected the seriousness with which they viewed the murders. Multiple death sentences were imposed. For the families of the victims, the verdicts represented accountability. But accountability is not the same as healing. A conviction cannot restore the person who was lost. It cannot return years stolen from families. It cannot erase the memories of the final phone call, the unanswered questions, or the empty space left behind. Justice has limits. It can determine responsibility. It can acknowledge wrongdoing. It can provide a legal conclusion. But grief does not follow the same timeline as a court case. Years after the trials ended, Warno's remained on death row. During that time, she continued to attract attention from journalists, filmmakers, and researchers interested in understanding her story. The public image of Warno's became increasingly complicated. Some viewed her as a symbol of female violence. Others viewed her as a tragic example of a life shaped by neglect and trauma. The reality existed within a difficult space between those extremes. She had committed crimes that resulted in the deaths of 7 men. She had also lived a life marked by extraordinary instability. Both facts remained true. In the final years before her execution, Warno's made statements that showed increasing acceptance of her fate. Her relationship with the legal process changed over time. She eventually stopped pursuing many of her remaining appeals and expressed a desire for the execution to proceed. On October 9, 2002, Eileen Warno's was executed by lethal injection at Florida State Prison. The execution brought a formal end to the legal case. But it did not bring an end to the questions surrounding it. The names of the victims remained the most important part of the story. Richard Mallory, David Spears, Charles Cascadon, Peter Seams, Troy Burress, Charles Humphreys, Walter Antonio. Each name represented a person whose life existed beyond the circumstances of their death. The justice system had reached its conclusion. The sentence had been carried out. But the larger questions remained. How does a person become capable of repeated violence? How should society respond to individuals shaped by profound suffering who later cause suffering themselves? And how can true crime stories remember offenders without allowing them to overshadow the people whose lives were taken? The courtroom provided a verdict. History continued searching for understanding. Some stories end when the verdict is delivered. Others continue long after the courtroom doors close. The case of Eileen Warno's officially ended on October 9, 2002, when she was executed at Florida State Prison. Legally, the process was complete. The investigations had been finished. The trials had concluded. The sentence had been carried out. But the questions surrounding the case did not disappear. They remained in books, documentaries, interviews, academic discussions, and conversations about crime, trauma, justice, and human behavior. Because some cases become more than criminal investigations. They become mirrors. They forced society to examine uncomfortable realities about violence, vulnerability, and the consequences of ignoring people who exist on the edges of communities. The story of Eileen Wuornos is often remembered because of the person convicted of the crimes. Her face appeared in newspapers. Her name became internationally recognized. Her life became the subject of films and countless discussions. But behind that attention were 7 men whose stories deserved equal remembrance. Richard Malloy, David Spears, Charles Cuscaden, Peter Seams, Troy Burress, Charles Humphreys, Walter Antonio. Before their deaths, they were not evidence. They were not case numbers. They were not chapters in a criminal investigation. They were human beings with personal histories, relationships, memories, and people who cared about them. Their families experienced a loss that no verdict could completely repair. A conviction can answer the question of responsibility. It cannot answer every emotional question left behind. It cannot recreate a final conversation. It cannot return someone who should have come home. The aftermath of violent crime is often measured in years rather than days. Investigators eventually leave the case. Courtrooms eventually become empty. Reporters move on to other stories. But families continue living with the consequences. A missing photograph remains on a wall. A familiar voice exists only in memory. A holiday tradition changes forever because someone who once sat at the table is no longer there. That is the reality that exists beyond the headlines. The case also changed the way many people discussed female offenders and violent crime. Before Wuornos, the image of a serial killer in popular culture was often overwhelmingly male. Her crimes challenged assumptions about who could commit extreme violence and what such violence could look like. But the public fascination surrounding her story also created another problem. The attention sometimes shifted toward the offender rather than the victims. This is a common challenge in true crime. The person responsible for a crime often becomes the most recognizable figure. Their childhood is examined. Their psychology is analyzed. Their motives are debated. Meanwhile, the people they harmed can become secondary characters in their own tragedies. A responsible telling of this case requires remembering that understanding an offender does not mean excusing them. Examining a person's past does not erase their choices. Studying the causes behind violence does not reduce the suffering of those affected by it. Understanding and accountability must exist together. Wuornos' life has often been discussed through the lens of trauma. Her childhood was marked by instability. Her adulthood was shaped by poverty, isolation, and survival. Mental health experts examined her psychological condition. Researchers studied her behavior. Many attempted to understand how such a violent outcome could emerge from a life filled with hardship. These questions matter. Prevention depends on understanding risk factors. Communities cannot address problems they refuse to acknowledge. Childhood neglect, abuse, untreated mental illness, and extreme social isolation can create conditions where vulnerable people become increasingly disconnected from society. But understanding those factors is not the same as predicting someone's actions. Millions of people experience suffering without ever harming others. Hardship may influence a person's life. It does not determine every decision they make. That distinction remains essential when examining cases like this. The debate surrounding Wuornos also raised difficult questions about self-defense. Her claim that she acted out of fear became one of the most discussed aspects of the case. Some observers believed her history and the dangers associated with her work deserved greater consideration. Others argued that the pattern of killings, theft of property, and evidence presented during trial demonstrated intentional murder. The courts ultimately rejected the self-defense argument. But the broader discussion continues because it touches on complicated issues involving violence against women, criminal responsibility, and how the legal system evaluates claims of fear and danger. There are no simple answers. Human experiences are rarely simple. The same case can contain multiple truths that exist alongside one another. The victims suffered irreversible loss. The crimes were real. The evidence led to convictions. The circumstances of Warno's life were also real. A complete understanding requires acknowledging all of these realities without allowing one to erase another. Years after her execution, the name Aileen Wuornos remains recognized around the world. Her story has been adapted into films, examined in documentaries, and analyzed by criminologists. The 2003 film Monster brought renewed attention to her life, with Charlize Theron portraying Wuornos in a performance that received widespread recognition. The film introduced many viewers to a dramatized version of events, but like many adaptations, it simplified and altered certain details for storytelling purposes. The real case remains more complicated than any movie can fully capture. Reality contains uncertainty, contradictions, unanswered questions. It contains victims whose lives cannot be reduced to the circumstances of their deaths and a defendant whose history cannot be separated from the crimes she committed. Perhaps the greatest lesson from this case is not about one person. It is about the importance of paying attention before tragedy occurs. People living in isolation are easier to overlook. Victims who exist outside society's attention are easier to forget. Warning signs can remain unnoticed when communities fail to recognize suffering until it becomes impossible to ignore. The story of Aileen Wuornos began long before the murders. It began with a childhood shaped by instability. It continued through years of struggle and survival. It reached a devastating point when 7 men lost their lives. And it ended with a legal conclusion that answered some questions while leaving others behind. Every crime has a moment when everything changes. For the victims, that moment was the end of their lives. For their families, it was the beginning of years of grief. For investigators, it was the moment they committed themselves to finding answers. For the justice system, it was a test of how society responds to the most serious forms of violence. And for history, it became a reminder that behind every headline are real people. Real families. Real consequences. The highways of Florida continue to carry millions of travelers every year. The forests remain quiet. The roads continue forward. Most people who travel them will never know the story hidden beneath those miles. But remembering that story means remembering more than the name of the person who committed the crimes. It means remembering those who never had the chance to tell the rest of their own stories. Because in the end, true crime is not only about understanding how a tragedy happened. It is about recognizing who was lost. And making sure those lives are never reduced to the darkest moment that ended them. Years after the final courtroom arguments ended and the prison gates closed behind Aileen Wuornos, the case continued to exist in a different place. Not in police files. Not in evidence rooms. Not inside a courtroom. It continued in public memory. Some criminal cases disappear with time. Names that once dominated newspapers slowly fade as new events replace them. Witnesses grow older. Details become harder to remember. The world moves forward. But certain cases remain. They remain because they force people to confront questions that do not have simple answers. The case of Aileen Wuornos became one of those cases. It was never only about 7 murders committed along Florida highways. It became a discussion about violence, gender, poverty, trauma, mental health, and the difficult boundaries between explanation and responsibility. The public reaction to Wuornos was complicated from the beginning. For some, she represented the face of a dangerous offender who had committed unforgivable crimes. For others, her life represented a series of failures that occurred long before the murders, failures of family, community, and systems designed to protect vulnerable people. The tension between those views shaped the way the case was remembered. People wanted a simple answer. They wanted to know whether Eileen Wuornos was a victim or a perpetrator. But real lives rarely fit into categories that clean. A person can experience suffering and still cause suffering. A person can be harmed by others and still be responsible for harming others. The existence of one truth does not erase another. That complexity is one reason the case continues to be studied. Criminologists, psychologists, journalists, and legal scholars have examined Wuornos' life because it raises important questions about the development of violent behavior. Her childhood contained many factors commonly associated with future instability. Abandonment, violence, lack of consistent support, poverty, emotional isolation. But researchers studying crime understand that these factors do not create a predictable path. Many people survive difficult childhoods and build compassionate, peaceful lives. Hardship may influence someone. It does not determine who they become. That distinction matters because society often searches for a single explanation after extreme violence occurs. People want one moment, one cause, one event that explains everything. But human behavior is usually the result of many influences interacting over time. The investigation into Wuornos also changed public discussions about female offenders. For decades, popular culture often presented violent criminals as male figures. The idea of a woman committing serial murders challenged many assumptions. The media attention surrounding Wuornos was intense partly because she did not fit the traditional image many people associated with serial killers. She became a subject of fascination. Her interviews were analyzed. Her expressions and behavior were studied. Her past was repeatedly examined. But this attention created another important conversation. When society becomes fascinated with criminals, there is a risk that the person responsible becomes more famous than the people they harmed. The danger of true crime storytelling is that the offender can become the center of the narrative. The mystery becomes about the killer. The investigation becomes about the killer. The psychology becomes about the killer. Meanwhile, victims can disappear into the background. A responsible examination of crime requires resisting that imbalance. The victims were not simply evidence in a legal case. They were people whose lives existed before their deaths. They had childhood memories, personal struggles, friendships, family relationships, dreams that ended without warning. The legacy of the Wuornos case should not only be the recognition of the person convicted. It should also include remembrance of those whose lives were taken. Another major discussion surrounding the case involved the relationship between trauma and criminal responsibility. Wuornos' history led many people to ask whether severe trauma can influence how someone reacts to perceived danger. This question became especially significant because Wuornos claimed that she acted out of fear during her encounters with the victims. The legal system examined those claims and ultimately rejected them. The courts determined that the evidence supported murder convictions. However, the broader conversation remained. How should society understand people who have experienced violence and later commit violence themselves? How can mental health professionals identify individuals at risk before tragedy occurs? How can communities intervene before isolation becomes dangerous? These questions extend far beyond one criminal case. They involve public health, social support, law enforcement, and human responsibility. The case also demonstrated the importance of investigative cooperation. The murders occurred across different locations, involving multiple jurisdictions and separate investigations. Connecting them required patience and communication. It required detectives to look beyond individual cases and recognize a larger pattern. Modern technology has changed criminal investigations dramatically. Digital records, advanced databases, and improved forensic methods allow investigators to connect information faster than ever before. But the foundation remains the same. Careful observation, persistence, attention to detail, the willingness to continue searching when answers are difficult to find. The investigation into Warnos showed that major breakthroughs often come from ordinary details. A transaction record, a remembered conversation, a vehicle connection, a person willing to speak. Small pieces becoming part of a larger picture. The case also remains part of discussions about the death penalty. Warnos's execution reignited debates about capital punishment, particularly regarding defendants with histories of severe trauma and mental health concerns. Supporters argued that the seriousness of the crimes justified the sentence. Opponents questioned whether execution was appropriate given Warnos's psychological condition and life history. These debates continue across the United States. They involve questions about punishment, justice, rehabilitation, and society's response to extreme crimes. There is no single answer accepted by everyone. Different people approach the issue through different moral and legal perspectives. That is why cases like this remain controversial long after the legal process ends. The story of Eileen Warnos has also influenced popular culture. Books, documentaries, and films have attempted to interpret her life and crimes. The film Monster brought the case to a wider international audience and focused heavily on the transformation of Warnos from a struggling woman on the margins of society into a convicted murderer. The performance portraying Warnos received significant recognition, but fictional adaptations inevitably make choices. They combine events, emphasize certain moments, and leave others out. A movie can introduce a story. It cannot replace the complexity of reality. The real case contains unanswered questions, conflicting interpretations, and human experiences that cannot be completely captured on screen. Perhaps the most important legacy of the Warnos case is the reminder that crime stories are never only about crime. They are about people. They are about choices. They are about consequences. They are about the moments when society succeeds or fails to recognize suffering. They are about the responsibility to remember victims while also seeking to understand how terrible events occur. The highways where these crimes became part of history continue to exist. People still travel those roads. They still stop at gas stations. They still drive through forests and small towns without knowing what happened there decades earlier. The world moves forward. But memory remains. The names of the victims remain. The lessons remain. The case of Eileen Warnos does not provide easy answers about human nature. Instead, it leaves behind difficult questions. How do we recognize danger before it becomes tragedy? How do we help vulnerable people before they disappear into isolation? How do we seek justice while preserving compassion for those affected? And how do we tell stories of violence without allowing violence to become the only thing remembered? Because the true measure of understanding a crime is not how well we remember the person who committed it. It is whether we remember the people who were lost. And whether we learn enough from the past to prevent another tragedy from taking shape in the future. A criminal case can end in a courtroom. But a story built around human lives rarely ends there. When the final judgment has been delivered and the legal documents have been filed away, people are often left with questions that the justice system was never designed to answer. Courts decide responsibility. They determine whether evidence meets a legal standard. They decide punishment. But courts do not always resolve the emotional, psychological, and moral questions that remain afterward. The case of Eileen Warnos is one of those cases. More than 2 decades after her execution, people still examine the same questions that surrounded the investigation from the beginning. What exactly happened during those encounters on Florida's highways? How much of Warnos's explanation reflected reality? How much did her past influence her actions? Could anything have prevented the tragedy? And perhaps most importantly, how should history remember a case where both suffering and violence existed at the same time? These questions continue because the evidence provided answers about certain events, but not every moment that existed between them. The victim's final hours remain partly unknown. The conversations before the shootings were never fully reconstructed. The emotions of everyone involved disappeared with the passage of time. Investigators could establish facts. They could establish where bodies were found. They could establish connections between Wuornos and the victims. They could establish that she had admitted to the shootings. But the private moments inside those vehicles, the thoughts of the people involved, and the exact sequence of every decision remain part of the uncertainty that surrounds many violent crimes. This uncertainty is not unusual. In fact, it is one of the hardest realities of criminal investigation. People often expect investigations to reveal a complete story. A beginning. A middle. An ending. A clear explanation. But real investigations are rarely complete narratives. They are reconstructions. They are attempts to understand the past using whatever evidence remains. Sometimes that evidence is enough for a conviction. Sometimes it is enough to establish responsibility. But it may never answer every question a person wants to ask. One of the most debated questions in the Wuornos case involved her claims of self-defense. From the beginning, Wuornos maintained that she believed she was endangered during the encounters. She described herself as someone reacting to threats rather than someone intentionally seeking victims. The prosecution presented a different interpretation. They argued that the repeated pattern of killings, the theft of property, and the circumstances surrounding the crimes demonstrated a deliberate motive. The courts ultimately accepted the prosecution's argument and rejected the self-defense claim. Yet the debate continued outside the courtroom. Some people focused on the reality that many sex workers experience violence and danger while doing their work. They argued that those risks deserved recognition and that society often ignores people living in vulnerable situations until tragedy occurs. Others argued that acknowledging those dangers could not change the evidence presented in the murders for which Wuornos was convicted. Both perspectives became part of the public conversation. This debate reveals one of the difficulties of discussing true crime. People often search for a single version of events that removes all uncertainty. But some cases resist simple conclusions. A person can be vulnerable and still be responsible for terrible actions. A victim can have lived an ordinary life and still become part of a complicated legal debate. A criminal case can involve social failures without reducing personal accountability. These realities can exist together. Another unresolved discussion surrounding Wuornos involved her mental health. Throughout her life and legal proceedings, questions were raised about her psychological condition. Experts examined her behavior, her statements, and her understanding of the legal process. Some observers believed that her mental state should have played a larger role in how society responded to her crimes. Others argued that regardless of psychological difficulties, she understood her actions and should be held accountable. The law ultimately determined that she was competent to stand trial and responsible for her crimes. But mental health discussions surrounding the case continued because they touched on broader issues affecting many communities. How should society identify people in crisis? How can intervention happen before someone reaches a point of extreme violence? How can mental illness be addressed without reducing personal responsibility? These questions extend far beyond one individual. They represent challenges faced by families, healthcare systems, and communities around the world. The story of Wuornos also raises questions about childhood and prevention. Her early life was marked by instability and hardship. Many people who study the case have examined whether earlier support, protection, or intervention could have changed her path. It is impossible to know. History does not allow experiments. There is no alternate timeline where we can see what might have happened under different circumstances. But the question remains valuable because prevention depends on learning from the past. Children experiencing neglect or violence need support. People living in extreme isolation need connection. Individuals facing mental health struggles need access to care. These lessons matter regardless of what conclusions someone reaches about Wuornos herself. The investigation also left behind lessons about cooperation between law enforcement agencies. The murders crossed different jurisdictions. No single department possessed every piece of information at the beginning. The breakthrough required different sources of evidence to come together. A vehicle. A transaction. A witness. A statement. A relationship. The investigation demonstrated that major cases are often solved not through one dramatic discovery but through the careful combination of many smaller details. The public often remembers the moment of arrest. But behind that moment are months of work by investigators who examine information most people never see. Reports. Interviews. Records. Evidence. Reconstructed timelines. The process is slow because the truth is rarely found in one place. It must be built. Another question that remains is how popular culture has shaped the memory of the case. Films and documentaries introduced Wuornos to audiences around the world. Some focused on her childhood. Some focused on the murders. Some focused on her relationship with Tyria Moore. Each interpretation highlighted different aspects of the story. But every adaptation faces the same challenge. Reality is more complicated than entertainment. A film has limited time. A documentary must choose what to include. A viewer may leave with a particular impression based on which parts of the story receive the most attention. This creates an important responsibility for storytellers. True crime should not become a celebration of offenders. It should not transform real suffering into entertainment alone. The people who lost their lives must remain at the center. The victims must not become background details in a story about the person who harmed them. The legacy of the Wuornos case is therefore not simply the story of a convicted murderer. It is also a story about how society remembers. What details do we preserve? Whose voices do we amplify? What lessons do we carry forward? Every generation revisits famous criminal cases differently. New research appears. New perspectives develop. People ask different questions based on the concerns of their own time. The Wuornos case continues to be discussed because it sits at the intersection of many difficult subjects. Violence. Gender. Trauma. Justice. Mental health. Responsibility. Memory. It does not provide comfortable answers. Perhaps that is why it remains so deeply examined. The easiest stories are the ones where everyone fits neatly into a role. A perfect victim. A perfect villain. A simple explanation. Real life rarely offers that simplicity. Real people are more complicated. Real tragedies leave behind more questions than answers. The final chapter of the legal case ended in 2002. But the conversation continues. Not because the crimes should be forgotten. Not because the suffering should be minimized. But because understanding how tragedies happen is one of the ways society attempts to prevent them from happening again. The names of the victims remain the most important part of that memory. They remind us that behind every investigation is a human cost. Behind every headline is a family. Behind every case file is a life that existed long before the crime. And perhaps the greatest lesson left behind by this case is that justice is not only about reaching a verdict. It is also about remembering what was lost. Because when history looks back at the darkest moments of human behavior, the goal should not only be to understand the person who caused harm. It should be to honor those who never had the chance to finish their own stories.